Did you ever want to restore the front suspension and steering on your MGB so that it looked like this? But were afraid that once you took it apart, you wouldn't be able to put it back together again. Stick around and find out how to reassemble the front suspension and steering on a 1972 MGB. Welcome to another episode of Maggie's Makeover, where I'm attempting to restore my 1972 MGB that I bought in 1977, drove until 1981, took off the road until 2022, upon which time I started this epic restoration journey. You know, in our last episodes, Mechanic Steve was busy refurbishing some of Maggie's front suspension and steering components. In this episode, Mechanic Steve is actually going to use those components along with a host of new parts to reassemble Maggie's front suspension and steering back into the car. The episode is actually kind of long, so we're going to break it up into 2 half-hour sessions. For those of you who have done this work or who are contemplating on doing this work, leave us some comments. You know, we learn from you as much as you learn from us. And I will have to say, Mechanic Steve kind of comes off like a know-it-all as he throws around the torque specs for every single nut and bolt on the car. Well, he actually got those from a great document I found online. I'll leave you the link of that in the final credits of the episode. And so without further ado, let's head down to the garage and check in with Mechanic Steve to see how he's proceeding. Hey, thanks for a great handoff, Studio Steve, and welcome back to the garage, everybody. You know, I'm super excited about this episode because we're finally going to be able to reassemble Maggie's front suspension and steering back into the car. Now, we're going to do that using a number of the parts which we refurbished in some of the earlier episodes that you can go check out, as well as using a number of new parts that we purchased from a number of different manufacturers. So some of you are out there probably saying, well, what's the best way to approach this? It's pretty simple. We're just going to take the steps that we took to disassemble it and reverse them. So what does that physically look like? Well, we're going to take our new front suspension crossmember. We're going to mount to it our bump stops on the left and the right side. We're then going to mount the 2 spigots on the left and the right that actually center the coil springs. Once that's done, this front suspension crossmember will still be relatively light. We're going to jack it up in place underneath the car and attach it to the frame with this new mounting hardware and these Super Pro polyurethane bushings. Now, once that's back into the car, we're going to build up the lower wishbone assembly through the spring pan and 2 of these arms. Both of these are new parts. We're going to attach that to the front suspension crossmember through these 2 new pivot pins, which are going to be bolted to the front suspension crossmember. Once that's in place, we're going to take our new reconditioned shock absorbers. These are actually Maggie's shock absorbers that I sent out to Worldwide Auto Parts out in Wisconsin to have them refurbished. We'll mount those to the front suspension crossmember, and once that's done, we now have the 2 mounting points for the swivel assembly. We are going to mount the bottom part of the swivel assembly first, put the spring coil in, rest it on the spring pan, raise that up and jack it up, and then connect it to the swivel assembly to the front shock absorber. Now, there are a whole set of mounting hardware, new hardware kits that I bought, as well as new Super Pro polyurethane bushings that we are going to use. Once that swivel assembly is in the car, we're going to take our refurbished hubs and put those onto the spindle of the swivel assembly. After that's completed, we're going to mount our control arms to the swivel assembly, and then take our reconditioned, refurbished steering rack and mount that back into the car. Once that's completed, we're going to attach these control links to the lower wishbone assembly, and the final step is to actually attach the sway bar to the car and then to those control links. So that's the process we're going to take to reassemble Maggie's front suspension and Crossmember. I'm not concerned about the parts that we refurbished. I am a little concerned about the new parts that we bought to see if they are manufactured within spec and if all of this assembles together like that. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get to work. Okay, so let's put our bump stops in. That's this part right here with a spacer that goes down here. You're going to notice there's two size bolts here and here. The larger one goes through the bottom where that spacer is. So let's line this up and put it on and bolt it up. And my biggest fear is coming true. Oh no. So none of these holes line up. Why is that? Let's go back to the old part. Thank God I saved the old part. Don't throw your old parts away, guys. You may need them for situations like this. Let's see what happens if we use the old part with the new spacer. And that lines up perfectly. So why is that? Seems like to me that between this surface and that surface, it's a uniform distance, and that spacer actually fits. So those are parallel surfaces versus the new one, where I think you can see that it's not. It's a bigger dimension on the top versus the bottom. Okay, so I was able to take the new bump stops, use our friend Victor the Vice, place them in there, and through some gentle persuasion, adjust these angles. You can see I have the bolts and the lock washers in there. I kept them fairly loose to be able to line them up. And I think all we have to do now is tighten this up. Now I couldn't find a spec on this, so we're going to tighten this up kind of mechanic tight, if you will. And now we can go mechanic tight on these. Yeah, that's good there. And that's good on that one. So now we have the first bump stop in. Now it's time to move on to the spigot on this side. Okay, so looking up into the front suspension crossmember, you can see the area where the coil spring fits in. That's where these spigots go. So I'm going to take these. I have the two bolts in them. I'm going to try to line these up blind. Oh, I got lucky with one of them. I should just be able to rotate that. There you go. These are 7/16 inch nuts and bolts. We have lock washers and nuts on the other end. All right, that's good on that one. All right, we're going to do the same for the other side. So now with the refurbished front suspension crossmember securely bungeed to the jack, we're going to get ready to roll this underneath the car and put it in place so we can attach it to the frame. Now, before we do that, we're going to have a discussion about the mounting hardware and the bushings that are going to be used in that process. So as we look at the front suspension crossmember, you're going to know that there are two attachment points, a front and a rear, on both the left side and also the right side. Now, how is it that we're going to attach this to the frame? we're going to use these specialized bolts in each of those 4 locations. And what you're going to notice about these is that they're threaded on either end, and on this end, the lower end, it's actually tapered. And it's that taper that's going to self-center the cross member as that taper mates with the hole in the frame. Now, to isolate this front suspension cross member from the frame so we don't get a lot of vibrations, this is where the Super Pro Poly bushings come in, and there's 2 for each of the bolting locations. There's one that's flat, and there's one that actually has a circular ridge on it. That circular ridge one goes on top here. This one goes on the bottom underneath, and that sandwiches the metal of the front suspension cross frame as it mates with the frame rails. And so how this all goes together is that you're going to take that tapered bolt, put that Super Pro bushing on there. Now there's a metal plate, and there's a ridge on that metal plate that goes on the outside. That's going to distribute the load across that bushing. And then there's a nut that actually screws onto here, like so. And there's a nylon at the end of this so they don't come undone. So how are we going to get these in? We're going to take the threaded rod, put it up underneath here on the rear. This is actually going to sit over it, and you notice that that bushing kind of fits tight over that tapered area. And I'm hoping that that's going to hold those in place because I'm the only one that's doing this job. Once those poke through the frame rails, there's a washer, pretty big washer, and then a nut on top, and then we torque those down. Now the other thing, so that's how the rear ones go in. It's a little bit different up in front because you're going to have to take this assembly, put it through the inside cavity of the front suspension cross member. Let me see if I can do this for you, like this, and then pull this up through here. And then take the ridged bushing and push that down and pull that up, and you'll see it's going to hold it into place. Okay, so now with that explanation out of the way, let's start to roll this front suspension cross member underneath the car and jack it up. Now, as we're raising this, you're going to notice that there's the brake line right here that appears to be in the way. That's because the jack is moving this up. As it does it, it's pushing the front suspension cross member forward. We just have to remember to pull this back behind the front suspension cross member in its proper place. So let me see if I can do that. There we go. And so now, before we bring the subframe fully up to the frame rails of the car, I've taken the Super Pro polyurethane bushings and I've coated them in this special lubricant on any surface that's going to touch metal. And that will help us so that we won't hear squeaking, or so the theory goes. So I'm now going to place these in to the proper locations. Again, these are the ones with the ridged section that go down into the hole. So now both of those are in. I'm going to do the same on the other side, and then we're going to lift this up and fully touch the frame and start to put the bolts in. Before we lift the front suspension cross member to meet the frame, it's important to note that we did apply the lubricating grease on the top surface of the Super Pro polyethylene bushings, because those are going to touch the frame rail. And so up we go the remaining part of the way until we get some contact. There we go. I think we got good alignment on the front driver's side hole. So let's see if we can push this up there. And you notice I have the nut and bolt there so that I can quickly, the washer, and the bolt so I can quickly attach it so it doesn't fall back through. So let's see if we can get that done. Okay, I think it's in the hole. Let's see if we can push this up through. And let's quickly put this washer on it. All right, let's try the other side. You have to line up the frame and the bushing. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Is that through? That is through. All right, so the hardest ones are now done. Now we got to move to the rear ones, which should be a lot easier because you don't have to go in the internal cavity of the front suspension crossmember. Okay, so I think we're at the point where we can now torque these down. Looked up the spec and it's 55 foot-pounds. So we're gonna go kitty corner on this, starting with the rear passenger side. Let's turn. That's 55 on that one. Let's go across here. 54. 55 on that. Let's try this one. 55 on that. Now this one, the last one. $55. And so with that, Maggie's front suspension cross frame is back in the car. So now it's time to mount the front shock absorbers. There's 4 bolts that are going to mount them to the front suspension cross frame. And although the refinisher actually plugged these up when he did the reconditioning and the painting of the front suspension cross member, I just didn't like the way the bolts were going in, so I actually re-tapped them, chased them, right, with a 3/8 24 thread per inch tap. And so basically 4 bolts. I'm going to put this up here like this. And I want you to note that I also undid this bolt here and that bolt back there so that we'll be able to pry this open when we put in the spindle assembly. Also, it's a great time to sand off the paint at the end of the shock lever where the fulcrum bolt is going to go through, because those tolerances are pretty tight. So let's put in the nuts and bolts and tighten this down. And according to the shop manual, these are going to be tightened down to 43 foot-pounds. That's that one. That's that one. That's that one, and one more to go. And that's that one. So now the refurbished front shock absorber on the passenger side is now in. So now that we have the front shock absorber in, we actually have the top attachment point for the swivel assembly in the car. The lower attachment for the swivel assembly is actually the lower wishbone assembly. This is Maggie's lower wishbone assembly along with a torsion bar link. And you can see it's pretty old. The bushings are all ripped up. We're just not going to use it. That came pretty close to the race car, fans. Did you know that the people only pay attention to the first 10 minutes and the last 10 minutes of a presentation, and you got to do stuff like that to wake them up? Well, hopefully you're awake now. Let's continue. So when you buy a lower wishbone assembly, it comes in 3 pieces: a spring pan, a rear arm, and a front arm. So in order to prepare these to be put into the car, we first have to press fit in these Super Pro poly bushings. You see, I've done that here in one of the arms of the lower wishbone. I need to do that for the remaining 3 other arms that are in there. So let me show you how I press fit these in, and then we'll assemble the rear arm to the spring pan. So there's basically 4 pieces that have to come together. There is the arm of the lower wishbone assembly, 2 bushings and a metal sleeve. These 2 bushings get put in here, and then the metal sleeve gets driven in through the vise. So you have to coat these, which I have done with this lubricant, so that these don't squeak. Get a good coating there. And then you also put some on the inside as well for that metal sleeve. Okay, so now that that's in, we need to take and press fit in this metal sleeve. Starting to go in. Just pushed itself in. And let's just drive this the rest of the way in. And there we go. And so that's press fit in. You can see that they're pretty even, nice and flush with the bushing itself. So to attach the rear arm to the spring pan, first you have to determine which is the rear arm. Let me just again hold this up so that you can see that. This is the rear arm because the front arm has the bigger hole for the sway bar control link. So that's what we're going to use with the channel facing out towards me, flat surface to flat surface. These are 1/2 inch nuts and bolts that we're going to use with lock washers. So let's get these started. Just going to bolt these up. I'm just going to snug these for now. I think we'll do the final tightening of them once we get the lower wishbone in the car. So that's how that goes together. And we'll just do the same for the other side of the car. And so it's now time to mount the pivot pin to the front suspension crossmember. Here's the pivot pin. You can see there are 2 sides to it. It's the flat side that obviously goes down. The bolting configuration is for the outer bolts to actually come down from the top and the inner ones to go up from the bottom. So let's just get this lined up. Hopefully my hands aren't in the way. And there's lock washers. You're also going to note that the nuts that go on the outer, I think they're retaining nuts. I think that's what they call them. They're different than the inner ones in that they have a circular raised profile on the head where the inner ones are flat. So we put the lock washers on. These are 3/8 fine threaded bolts. So now let's put the inner ones on. So now we're going to torque these. I wasn't able to find a torque spec on these, but since they're the same size and thread of the shock absorbers, we're going to tighten these to what we did those, which was 43 foot-pounds. That's that one. That's that one. That's that one. And that's that one. And with that, the pivot pin is in. So now it's time to attach the wishbone assembly to the pivot pin. we're simply going to take that and slide that on. We're going to first remove these protective coverings that came with the pivot pins to protect the threads. I also put a little anti-seize on these on the ends of the pivot pins so that the next person who's working on this car is going to be able to really be able to take this apart should they need to. So we'll take this. All we're going to do is just slide that onto the pivot pin. We're going to take the other arm with the channel out, slide that on to the pivot pin, and now we are going to bolt up the front part of it. I think it's a 9/16 inch bolt that goes in back here to the top. There's a lock washer we're going to put on and a nut. And what actually holds the bottom part of the front arm to the spring pan is the control link to the sway bar. So that's going to go in from the front to the back like this. And there is a lock washer and a 3/4 inch nut that goes with that. So let's get that started. And now we're going to take out the slack in these. You'll see there's a little bit of a gap here, but that will pull together once we tighten these bolts up. Now I'm not going to tighten these to assembly tightness until I get the swivel assembly in. And we now have to put on a washer and the castellated nut to hold this in place. Now this castellated nut also has a split pin in it, and we're not going to put those on either. I mean, my goal in this is to get Maggie back on her feet, not necessarily drivable, more of a rolling platform to get her painted. And then we're going to torque down. We'll snug these up, but we're going to torque them down to the right specs later on after we get the engine in the car. Now, I know a lot of people will say this is on a metal sleeve and a metal spindle part of the pivot pin, and that's going to rotate no matter how tight these are. I guess what I'm going to do is put the engine in, make sure I have the right ride height, and then torque these up. I've heard stories of people torquing these up without the engine in, and then when they put the engine in, there's not enough give on these, and you get the wrong ride height. So we're going to sort of leave these snug until that point in time. So now the lower wishbone assembly is in Maggie. Okay, people. Given that the creative minds behind Maggie's Makeover want to limit each episode to around 30 minutes, I've been informed by the editing staff that we have enough content to fill an episode. And you know, this is a great point to take a break in the work. So I'm going to send it back to you, Studio Steve, for the episode wrap-up. Thanks, Mechanic Steve, and congratulations on some solid progress on this part of the restoration. You know, for those of you who enjoyed this episode, make sure you come back and watch the next episode where Mechanic Steve actually finishes the reassembly of Maggie's front suspension and steering. Specifically, he's going to mount both of the swivel assemblies. He's then going to install Maggie's steering rack back in the car. That will be followed by installing the torsion bar, and finally, he's going to mount both of the reconditioned front hubs to the spindles. And so with that, it's a wrap for this episode of Maggie's Makeover. Both Maggie and I appreciate you riding along with us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Maggie's Makeover. that lower wishbone assembly is going to be attached. Something fell off the table. That wasn't supposed to happen. Now I got to do this all over again. Oh. All right, I'm not having a lot of fun right now, and I'm actually thinking I should have just bought a Miata. I wouldn't have to go through all this. It's the journey, Steve. It's the journey. It's not the destination. Keep telling yourself that, buddy. So we're just not going to use this. We're going to replace it. I think I just hit the car.